Thank you everyone for being here on this rather warm Saturday. Really grateful for you all showing up. I actually live here in Ojai. I've been here for almost 6 years, but previously I was born and raised in the Bay Area, primarily in San Francisco. And Louis, who still lives in the Bay Area, in Point Richmond, and I met in 1998 when I was doing research for a documentary for the local PBS station, KQED, that was on the Fillmore. And I had been researching the Fillmore neighborhood since 1986, when I was hired as day manager and historian of the Fillmore Auditorium when Bill Graham went back into the building and started promoting concerts. And he asked that I create a booklet about the Fillmore Auditorium's history, which started in 1912 when it was built by a woman and her 2 daughters who were land rich but cash poor. So it was a way for them to get some ongoing income in an era where women could not have, it was challenging for them to find work. And in researching that booklet, I realized that there was I found to be a much richer history of the Fillmore neighborhood, and it fed into my love of jazz, blues, and R&B, and so I got really excited about it. And at the same time, Lou was doing similar research, which he can talk about. So when we met in '98 and we realized our paths had been parallel for many years, we knew that we had to get together and create a project of some sort. Thus, the Harlem West book was born, and now it's also a website and a museum exhibit that's been shown in a variety of museums around California. So Lou, do you want to talk a bit about?
So I actually grew up in Seattle, and both of my parents were born in the South, and my father was discharged from the Army in Fort Lewis, and I think he kind of wandered into Seattle and ended up staying there and sent for my mom. And we would every year go to visit the grandparents, and I kind of, at a young age without really articulating it, but sort of started thinking about the effects of migration, like what people brought. And a family moved to San Francisco in 1964, actually from the East. And I spent a summer there before going away to college. And I remember, first of all, I thought San Francisco was where I wanted to move to, but it took me a while. But I remember that someone took me to the black part of town, and not knowing anything about the history, I was at that point able to sort of witness the sort of end of the when it was its heyday. It was on a Friday night, and the streets for many blocks were filled with people really well dressed. Everybody was having a great time, but I didn't really think about it. And I actually went away, came back down here to go to college, and then transferred to Berkeley in '68, and became a photographer a few years after that, and before I had been really interested in history and political science and culture. So I was kind of interested in the whole notion of migration, and in the probably the late mid-90s, I was actually hired by the redevelopment agency that you'll hear more about, because at that point this neighborhood we were talking about, had been basically wiped out by redevelopment. And there was an attempt to sort of make it like a jazz preservation district, to at least capture some of the history of this time that you'll see in a few minutes, that really had been wiped out. And so I'll talk a little bit more about kind of how I came to sort of view this, but I thought I'd talk a little bit about the neighborhood, and Elizabeth can also. So the Fillmore is kind of in the middle of San Francisco. It was actually the place after the San Francisco earthquake and fire where a lot of business and culture moved to. And in fact, this is a picture taken probably before World War II, because every intersection had these arches. And during World War II, the metal was taken down and used for scrap in the war effort.
So the neighborhood came about in the late 1800s as San Francisco grew crowded downtown. the Western Addition, or the Fillmore, it's known by both names, was the closest neighborhood or area to downtown Civic Center area, and so houses started to be built, and it actually became primarily a Jewish neighborhood. There were a number of synagogues, Jewish restaurants. So really, before it was an African-American neighborhood, it was a Jewish neighborhood. And then, as Lou said, when the earthquake happened, it was the closest neighborhood to downtown that wasn't wiped out by fire and earthquake. And so what happened was that all of the government offices, as well as newspapers, department stores, businesses, all relocated to the Fillmore district because that was the closest place that was still intact. And so when things were rebuilt, downtown San Francisco area, and businesses started, and government offices filtered back to where they once had been, what happened was the Merchants Association got together, like, how do we keep people coming back into the neighborhood? And so they decided to rebrand the neighborhood as an entertainment district. So pretty early on, the neighborhood became known as a place to come to go to dance clubs, vaudeville houses, movie theaters, restaurants. And this is a shot of the Fillmore Auditorium in 1914, soon after it was built. So it pretty much looks the same as it does today, as you can see. And then the arches made the Fillmore Street one of the most illuminated streets apparently in the entire country. What also happened after the earthquake is that many of the neighborhoods where people of color lived in San Francisco were wiped out, and so the Fillmore was one of the few neighborhoods that was actually welcoming to all people, and quite quickly it became one of the most diverse neighborhoods west of the Mississippi, which is pretty amazing for that time period. But it's not to say that there wasn't discrimination, because, like, for example, the Fillmore Auditorium, anyone who was not white wasn't allowed to go to the Fillmore Auditorium until 1950s. So that shows you that despite it being quite a diverse neighborhood, there still was discrimination going on.
So it was also the area that was San Francisco's Japantown, and I think this is the Dorothea Lange photograph, but this is a picture probably taken, I think, in the 30s, and it's so you can see these elementary school kids. And then after Pearl Harbor, the Japanese were interned, and simultaneously the ships on the West Coast in Hunters Point and in Oakland and in Vallejo and in Southern California, up and down the West Coast, sort of changed their focus. So simultaneous to the Japanese being interned and having to move from their houses and businesses, this is a picture taken, I think, at Tanforan of someone from the Fillmore with their belongings. Simultaneously, it was a call out for people to come from different parts of the country to work in the war effort. And many people say that it was actually World War II that ended the Depression. So, and San Francisco, which has always had very tight housing, the place where there was available housing was in the Western Addition, the Fillmore, where Japantown had been. So this is a picture taken in the late 40s of Fillmore Street, and actually in the back, on the right is the Fillmore Auditorium. Left, sorry. It's been a long day. And then the larger building next to it was a synagogue that eventually became, I think it had a number of iterations, and it was actually where Jim Jones and People's Temple was later. That was after this picture was taken. And you can actually see at this intersection that those arches you saw were now gone, because this was after World War II.
But you can see how many businesses are there. It's a vibrant, pretty thriving neighborhood. But it was at this time, this was taken by an African-American photographer named David Johnson, who was the first African-American to study with Ansel Adams. It's this gentleman right here, that it was during this time that the San Francisco Redevelopment Agency was formed, and they actually were starting to talk about dismantling the neighborhood and rebuilding it. Because you got to think at that time, you know, now we see Victorian houses and people want to live in them and restore them, and they're very highly sought after. But after World War II, they just wanted to wipe away what was old and rebuild it into something new. But also, I think a lot of government officials saw that there was this black neighborhood right next to downtown, and frankly, they just wanted them to leave and to have it rebuilt and bring in a new group of folks.
So David came, and this is actually a poster for a studio that he had, and he photographed for a while, although he had actually kind of stopped, and we discovered him when we were doing research for the book, and
no, for the film.
For the film, that's true. There was a film, and she'll tell you about that. But basically, his career was revitalized, and he now has work in the Bancroft Library and the Smithsonian. So it's been great, and he's actually the only living photographer now.
He still shoots photos. He's 92.
So I was always really interested in kind of the whole notion of the photographer in the 30s, and the people using speed graphics. And this is actually a picture of a guy who photographs in New York now named Luis Mendez, who I always go to see when I'm photographing. But this is one of the photographers from the area. Like a number of people were hired or would sort of develop a career in the jazz clubs. So what happened was all these people came to work in the shipyards, and there was a kind of concentrated urban area that had almost immediately multiple jazz clubs, black-owned hotels and restaurants, and churches. And we didn't find a lot of photographs from the churches, but a lot of the clubs had people who would photograph. People would photograph, go home, develop the film, make prints, and come back at 4 in the morning to bring the prints of people they had photographed.
Because at that time the clubs would stay open until like 6 a.m. So they were able to develop print and bring them back to the people before the clubs closed.
So I had been a friend of mine who was actually very interested in the sort of notion of the shoeshine parlor had sent me to this space, and inside, this is Red Powell who's on the right, inside he had photographs of a lot of people in the community, a kind of variety of things, something that I was kind of aware of that would happen in barbershops and beauty parlors and mortuaries, that they were kind of the archivists in the black community. If you can see behind him, there's a picture of Bobby Kennedy and Sitting Bull and Joseph Stalin and Bobby Freeman, who was one of the rhythm and blues stars. And then he had photographs of a lot of the entertainers who had passed through the community. So I got really excited and said, wow, this is great. Can I photograph your walls? And he said, absolutely not, and threw me out. And actually, probably within a very close time, Elizabeth had done the same thing doing her research for Bill Graham, and the same thing happened. So we had that in common. We both thrown out of Red's.
Because his shoeshine parlor, which had been moved 5 times because of redevelopment, every time it seemed like he had a new space, redevelopment was right behind him and said, okay, we're tearing this building now, you have to move again. So this was his 5th space.
Right.
In a span as he opened his shoeshine parlor in 1953. So he was pretty bitter and angry. He was really one of the last African-American owned businesses in the neighborhood. And at this time, his shoeshine parlor was lit. It was just across the street from the Fillmore Auditorium, so I would see him every day. But at this point, which was 1986, redevelopment had wiped out 20 square blocks within the Fillmore neighborhood. And even at that time, there was still quite a bit of land that had not been developed yet, and that was because the banks felt that it wasn't a safe bet to loan money to rebuild the neighborhood. And so many blocks stayed completely just dirt for several decades.
It looked like a war zone. And the other thing that happened, that people in the community organized and stopped the whole process sort of cold, and that's partly what happened. So it's funny about time, and it's been interesting when people tell a story. We had people tell completely opposite stories from one time to another. So history is kind of a moving, and especially urban, kind of oral history is always a moving target. But I'm a victim of it too. And then I thought a month after he'd kicked me out, I went back, but we sort of realized it probably was a year later, and I had gotten the name of my friend's brother was very good friend, said, just mention me and you'll be fine. And when I went back, he was gone, the walls were bare, and I remember asking someone outside, said, what happened? And they said, well, we think someone rescued his photographs, but we don't know, and don't know what happened to it. So, probably in the mid-90s, I was hired by the redevelopment agency to kind of do some research for this jazz preservation district, and I was across the street at the barber shop, and I'd been asking people, but not very systematically, do you know what happened? And I was across the street, and Reggie Pettis, the barber across the street, said, oh, they're in my back room. And it turns out Red had had a stroke not too long after both of us had been kicked out, and had died, and I think his son took it over for a little while, but he was not paying the rent, and the landlord had come in, pulled all the photographs off the wall and was about to throw them away. Reggie across the street sort of saw it and had rescued them all, so they were all sitting in his back room. And I got really excited about it, and he was excited as opposed to Red, and so let me use them for this report. And then I remember my friend Rupert at the San Francisco Art Commission said, well, you know, you have to show these. And so that's where I had the exhibit that Elizabeth came to see, and that's where we met. And when we met, uh-oh, I think we have a book, there's a book or something in our future. Little did we know.
We didn't know we'd turn into a 30-year thing that never seems to want to end.
So some of these photographs were really in bad shape, and I was of a certain generation where I was teaching photography, but I was completely comfortable in the darkroom, and this new thing I wasn't interested in. But some of my students actually knew Photoshop, so I remember asking someone, so could you restore this photograph? And fortunately he said, you know, you really need to do this yourself. And I had taken classes, but I wasn't using it. So once I started, you know, this was something I was invested in, then I was able to kind of get the skills to bring them back. And it was, there's always a controversy about kind of archivists, whether you're supposed to leave things alone or not, and I had no interest in that. I wanted to restore the photographs and the history to the way the prints looked when the photographers who made them came out.
So go back to
do that back?
Yeah.
Yes, okay, right.
So that's what it looked like when he found it, and this is what it looked like after he restored it.
Right.
But that's probably the way that the photographer, when he first took the image, would have printed it, and you know, it would have been. So we felt, you know, that we were honoring what the photographers had envisioned initially.
And another thing that would happen is we would show this work, you know, people in the neighborhood would see it and be really excited. And I have a good friend who grew up in the Fillmore, who's a photographer who lives in New York, and I went to see him, and I knew he'd want to see the book. So he's looking through the first edition of the book, and he stops dead on this picture, because that man on the left is a picture of the right. Boy. His left.
The guy leaning back right there in the hat.
Right. That was a picture of his father, who he had never seen, and and you can see they're like spitting image of it. It was pretty. So that's the most kind of radical example of that. But we had, every time we would show these, or people would say, "Oh, that's my auntie," and it was a great. The book kind of elicited a lot more information, which was great. So that was exciting.
So the way that after going back to 1986, the way that I started going about finding people was that when Bill had me start writing the pamphlet, I quickly realized that there was almost no information in the usual places, like the San Francisco Library, the California Historical Society. No one seemed to care or had even given it a thought to collect the history of non-whites in San Francisco, which I just found completely weird. But I think it was a combination of ignorance as well as the neighborhood being wiped out, and so people had to get out quickly. They were told when the redevelopment agency came and knocked on their door that they had 3 months to leave. If they own their house, there was like, here's how much we're going to pay you, no arguing, take it, go.
And a lot of businesses were just taken without recompense.
Exactly. And so people scattered to all over the place, and so a lot of their archives, their stuff was taken with them or thrown out in the haste of moving.
And some things were kept in people's basement. We knew they existed because we'd seen an example in the shoeshine parlor. This is a little out of sequence, but this was so. One of the questions was what happened after World War II when some of the Japanese came back, and this was a photograph we found of a wedding, and it was interesting to us to see who was in the wedding party, and that the old, the sort of newcomers and the old residents. They I think for the most part got together. Actually, there's a Japanese playwright that made a play that's had different iterations that was kind of inspired by this photograph, and in the new copy he sort of talks about that.
So what I would do is walk through the neighborhood after I realized that I wasn't going to get anywhere with the archives, and literally walk up to people who looked old enough to have experienced going to the clubs or living the history, and simply asking them if they had gone to any of the clubs or if they were musicians. And surprisingly, it yielded quite a few successes, interviews and finding photographs that way. So that was really the way that I started building my cachet of interviews and photos and memorabilia, is just simply asking people if they would share their stories. And most people were into it. Some people were very reluctant. But when this is the second edition of the book, the first edition came out in 2006 in a smaller form. And people who had not wanted to speak with us or let us use their photographs, when they saw the first book, felt that we had gotten the story right.
Which we were really relieved about.
And so we were able then to go and interview them, and they let us use their photos. And so this book is 100 pages bigger because of that, and we were able to include their stories. And even now, when we had the book release party up in San Francisco, I was introduced to two gentlemen that I had not met before, and I recently interviewed them. And then their stories will go on the website that we've created. California Council for the Humanities gave us a small grant to create a website. So it expands upon the story, because of course you can only put so much in a book.
But a lot of the photographs had no markings, and we had no dates or names. And this is actually a vaudeville performer named Bicycle. And those of you who know who Flavor Flav is, you can see that he did not original, right. But we kind of got some hints by there was a tradition, you'd see a double feature and a live show, like a review, and we saw that the posters in the background seemed to be maybe Korean War or perhaps World War II. So sometimes we can kind of interpolate when the dates were.
Does anyone have questions? Because please interrupt, raise your hand if you have any questions as we're talking. Does anyone have any?
At the end, please mention your book, Orleans Suite, which I saw on the table.
Oh, you did?
It's just read on the website about
you did? Okay. Well, the other thing that's interesting is that a lot of the people that came west, that came to LA and to all over California, came from Louisiana and Texas. And I know I live in Richmond, and I just saw like a Zydeco, this guy, he was born in California, but his family's from a small town in, the Zydeco country in southwest Louisiana. And I know, because I've seen it in Louisiana, it was the real deal. So this whole idea, and that's part of what we saw, a lot of people brought their musical taste and their musical practice with them, and that's what was really evident in the clubs. As well as restaurants. Right. And the bars, great bars, and sort of great, everybody said it was like, you would go and you dress, you didn't, if you were looking raggedy, you did not go out of your house.
So this is Jack's of Sutter. It was the first jazz club in the Fillmore, and it actually was pre-World War II. It was opened in 1931, and it was the first black-owned jazz club in the Fillmore. And there was two others, the Town Club and Club Alabama. And those were kind of the three clubs that started off the jazz scene. But really, it wasn't until World War II that it really exploded, and there was over 20 clubs at one point. People said that they would leave their house on Friday night and they wouldn't go home until early Monday morning. I don't know how they survived, how they slept. Maybe just that was.
They call that different.
Yeah, exactly.
This is the basement of the Booker T. Washington Hotel. That was a black-owned hotel, and you see the woman on the left. With the really neatly folded white gloves is Ella Fitzgerald, and there's a number of other prominent, including Don Newcomb, who was a pitcher for the Dodgers, and Joe Perry, who was a running back for the 49ers. So this was some kind of a fair, prominent people from the Bay Area. And I love things like, you know, her gloves, and the guy on the right's got these really great Argyle socks, and the rug. I mean, there's sort of these details are always really interesting to me.
So,
yeah.
I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
So in up until the late 1950s, only the most famous black musicians could play in the downtown clubs. But even if you were Ella Fitzgerald or Duke Ellington, you're welcome to play at the Fairmont or one of the bigger clubs downtown, but you were not allowed to stay there. And so they had to go back to the Fillmore to sleep in two of the hotels, either the Booker T. Washington or the Manor Plaza. But it was also great because African Americans weren't allowed to go downtown and see Duke Ellington or Ella Fitzgerald. So they would play for the white audience downtown San Francisco, come back to the Fillmore, and play for black audiences, and definitely probably had way more fun.
And there were a lot of after-hours places where people would jam. So it was interesting. And, you know, we sort of started seeing photographs and then started meeting people in the photographs, and then sort of stories started to come out of it. This is an unknown band sort of celebrating the release of their record, and, you know, I love the ads in the background. This is a publicity shot for the Four Naturals, and in fact, Frank Jackson, who was they had a rotating sort of set of musicians, but he mostly was had a trio. But I think for a short amount of time, he sat in with this group. So
he's the piano player,
yeah, and he's still living and has actually played.
92 still plays in the clubs in San Francisco.
So this is actually on Fillmore, and the second from the right is Louis Jordan, who some of you may know, who's in town, and the man next to him was a DJ who, of course, was named Little Tiny.
Big Tiny.
Yeah, Big Tiny. Was it Big? I thought it was Little Tiny. They were really doing irony.
And that was outside the Manor Plaza, yeah. One of the two main hotels.
Can you talk about this record show?
So this photo is interesting because it shows how research evolves. When we first saw this photograph, it was taken by David Johnson, the photographer we talked about, who was the first guy to study with Ansel Adams. And David remembered it as being the main record store in the Fillmore district called the Melrose Record Shop. And the Melrose Record Shop was on Fillmore Street, just down the road from where the Fillmore Auditorium was. And it was run by a Jewish guy named David Rosenbaum, who was obsessed with jazz, absolutely obsessed. And so we dated the photograph in the late 40s because Bilbo, who was this horrible racist senator from, I think, Alabama, had just died. And so
there was a big rhythm and blues hit.
Yes, it was a huge hit in the black music circuit, celebrating this dude dying. I'm very happy about it. So we were able to, we found out when that record was released and dated the photograph. So there is a newspaper that came out of the Fillmore called the Sun Reporter, and I had been trying for years and years and years to find copies of it during the Fillmore Jazz era. It was started in '46, still is, a form of it is still produced today. And no, because the archive was thrown out when they had to move out of the Fillmore because of redevelopment, no one seemed to have copies. So fast forward to when we decided to do a new version of the book, I found out that Berkeley had somehow, UC Berkeley had somehow unearthed 1951 to the present day copies of the Sun Reporter, and it put them on microfilm, which was absolutely amazing. Sat at the Ojai Library all summer looking through every single page of the Sun Reporter newspaper from 1951 to 1960. It took me 3 months. And by looking at every page, I realized that David's memories of what that record shop was actually inaccurate, because through reading articles as well as looking at the ads, I found out that David Rosenbaum actually had another record store that predated the Melrose Record Shop, and that his first store was called Rhythm Records, which he opened just after World War II, just down the street from Jack's of Sutter, which makes sense because it was the main jazz club in the Fillmore at that time. And that photograph that all these years we had thought was Rhythm Records was Melrose Record Shop was actually Rhythm Records. And so it was really great to be able to finally, put to rest where exactly this record shop was and who owned it. So we had many instances of that where photographs and events that were going on in the photographs, finally able to know what was actually happening because I was able to access. So yay to the Ojai Library. Thank them.
This is actually a photograph that David Johnson also took, and he was exhibiting work, and someone I knew, Danny Dawson, who's a choreographer and actor.
Danny Duncan.
Duncan, right, I know another. Who's on the left in this picture.
With the white little tie.
Yes. Showed up to the opening and identified himself, and then we interviewed him, and he talked about growing up in the neighborhood. So it was interesting to sort of see someone who had actually grown up in the neighborhood, whose mother had had house parties like in her Victorian, and this is another story that sort of happened with the second edition.
Well, and again, that photo, so he couldn't remember why Eartha Kitt was there. And so again, when I was reading through the Sun Reporter newspapers, there was an article about Eartha Kitt coming in December to play the Newsboys annual Christmas party at the Champagne Supper Club, which was owned by Don Barksdale, who was a basketball player turned club owner and DJ in San Francisco. And it was the party for the Newsboys, and those are Newsboys except for Danny Duncan. He said that he was just invited to come along because he was kind of well known in the neighborhood as this up-and-coming actor and dancer kid. So they invited him along. But it was great to finally know, like, okay, this is where this photograph was taken. This was where why this photograph was taken. So solving the mysteries of the photographs.
During World War II, when a lot of people were out, in the Army, that I think a lot more women had an opportunity to play. I love this one. Some musicians, like in the middle of the day and feeling a little disoriented.
So this is a little bit later, 1950s, when R&B and blues bands were starting to come into the scene.
This is Johnny Ingram, who had a band, and he was very excited about the project and sort of showed us his records and some of his artwork and let us use his materials. This was the Gold Mirror, which is one of the clubs in the neighborhood that was purchased by Leola King, who had actually grown up on a reservation. She was Native American and African American, and she sort of, when she came, she was one of the wealthiest women in San Francisco, and it changed the name of the club to the Blue Mirror. And I don't think they had a lot of live music, although we do have some examples of people.
They did.
Okay.
Yeah.
But a lot of people would hang out there. I mean, it was like a place where. So here's Louis Armstrong and his wife.
And Leola's in the big hat.
Right. And this is the Mills Brothers and their father performing there. It shows I was wrong. I've never been wrong. And so she was someone who said she had no photographs for us. And when the original copy came out, she got really excited about it and let us use her archive.
And interview her as well. She was actually one of the people in the Fillmore who suffered the most when redevelopment came. She owned a number of businesses, several nightclubs, including the Blue Mirror, a handful of houses. And because we think because she protests so loudly and really was digging her heels and not wanting to give in to the redevelopment, they kind of unleashed vengeance upon her and really bankrupt her But she continued fighting. She just passed a few years ago, and she fought them till literally the day she died, trying to get compensated for everything that she lost in redevelopment.
This is Edward G. Robinson at the Blue Mirror, and that's actually Leola's second from the right. And then here she is with her grandmother, I believe,
No, her
mother in the mansion that she had on Scott Street in San Francisco. And here she is with Josephine Baker. This is another one of the photographs that I restored. And here she is at a party with Wesley Johnson, who had a club called the Texas Playhouse. And then the woman on the right with the blonde hair was Lottie the Body, who was an exotic dancer. And we actually found Lottie later. We've been trying to find her, and eventually did. Yes.
She's so striking.
Yeah, it was amazing. And here she is with T-Bone Walker. And she was married to Goose Tatum, who was one of the Harlem Globetrotters. So we finally both went to Detroit, where she's living now. And she was, you know, actually still really cool. And also, you know, kind of let us have things from her archive. So it was great to sort of see someone who still, in fact, we had to cancel going to see her because she had been invited to a strippers convention in Las Vegas.
She was giving a keynote speech.
Right. She was like, considered her a role model.
She's great.
And this is a picture of Leola, who you saw before, later.
And was she ever compensated more fully for all her losses?
No. Although she was, you know, that someone was trying to take over the name of the Blue Mirror for a newer place, and we actually found her a lawyer to work pro bono, and she was able to stop that. And she was able to open. She actually had a club almost till the end. So she was able to open a new club downtown. It wasn't in that area, but it was never the same, and she was never compensated for the loss.
Yeah, she's. And her son actually, Tony, continues the fight. But it's kind of over with now because, I don't know, a few years ago, Governor Brown dismantled all the redevelopment agencies around California. And so actually the redevelopment agency in San Francisco no longer exists. So it's going to be, yeah, you can't fight something that doesn't exist any longer.
This was a club called the Club Flamingo that Wesley Johnson took over and, because he was from Texas, renamed it the Texas Playhouse. And his son, who we actually met when we were doing a sort of history walk, first was correcting me making misstatements, but then said he really liked what we were doing and let us use his father's archives. And some of his father's archives had been on the wall of Red's, the person I'd originally seen the archive from. So it was one of those things where people, when the club closed, they would give them to the people that would collect them. And he was known for wearing this kind of big white Stetson hat.
And he didn't have bands play at his club. He just would DJ and do his shtick with the microphone.
And his son went to UC, University of California, San Francisco Pharmacy School, and when they needed tuition, they had dollar bills in the bar as well as dollar bills hanging, and they took them all up to pay his tuition, which was a great story.
But you can see how packed it is and how dressed up everyone was. I mean, people really had a lot of fun.
After seeing pictures of all these guys in these great hats, I now have a collection of them to my house.
I went out and got my husband a couple.
Yeah. See, we scored for them. So this was actually, the person on the left is Charles Sullivan, who is called the mayor of the Fillmore. These are some of the posters.
Yes, from the Charles Sullivan era. So Bill started using the club on the off nights, and it was really where Bill Graham got the inspiration to book black acts with the hippie band. So that's why you see, somebody like Otis Redding playing with the Grateful Dead. And so unfortunately, when Charles Sullivan was murdered in mid-1966, and his murder was never solved, Bill then took over the lease of the Fillmore Auditorium, and the rest is history. Him booking that club until the early 1970s, when it just became too small, and so he was doing stuff at Fillmore West, which is on the corner of Van Ness and Market Street, and then also at Winterland and other places as well.
Although he then came back to the film.
Yeah, and that's when I came back. When I was 22, I was hired as the as I said, I was day manager and historian of the Fillmore Auditorium. And I worked for Bill until October '89 when the earthquake happened. It really damaged the Fillmore Auditorium. And so sadly, my era at the Fillmore was over for a while.
So there's two Fillmores.
Yeah. Well, there were a number. I mean, there was also Fillmore's in New York, but it became a franchise.
When they say Fillmore West, that's in San Francisco.
Yeah, but a different.
But that's the second one.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
So the original Fillmore was on the corner of Geary and Fillmore. And then when some of the acts, like the Jefferson Airplane or the Grateful Dead, got too big to play the Fillmore, which only is about 1,000 people, he then found a bigger venue, which at the time was called the Carousel Ballroom, and it was on the corner of Van Ness and Market Street. Up until recently, it was a Honda dealership, but if you went up on the second floor where they were repairing the Hondas, their green room was still there. You could see all the autographs of all the people that played the Fillmore West.
And so they named it to go with this other venue.
Yeah, so there's Fillmore West, then he had Fillmore East, which was in New York. So those were really the three of his.
Yeah, the sort of height he was.
Really is named after the one out here.
Yeah, it was his third venue. So it was Fillmore West, Fillmore East.
He was one of the top, promoters in the whole country. We had a friend, John Goddard, who had eventually had a record shop in Mill Valley. And when he was 14, he took the bus in from Mill Valley to see Little Richard at the Fillmore.
He's a massive fan.
Right, really massive fan. And was really frustrated because Little Richard had this left-handed guitarist who kept getting in the way, and it was Jimi Hendrix, like before. Although we've also had Jimi Hendrix scholars say that Little Richard had actually fired Jimi Hendrix by then because Jimi Hendrix was too weird for him. But John swears he's got had documented, right? So we kind of made some notice that some people have some story about it, but these kinds of stories are kind of really great in terms of the book. Billie Holiday spent a lot of time in the Fillmore, and this is a picture by Jerry Stoll. And here's a picture of her with Mel Torme, and we're not sure who the person is on the left. And here she is with Wesley Johnson. And so in the course of researching for the film and eventually for the book, we found some other photographers. This is Ricardo Alvarado, who came in the 30s from the Philippines as there was a sort of bachelor group of people that came, and he was working in the kitchen in the Presidio, the army base, and was living in this neighborhood and photographed kind of in the clubs along with other people, as well as photographed the sort of connection between, here's a house party with probably a really eclectic and interesting group of music. And so it was great to sort of, we found this photography, and actually his daughter sort of had collected his work and it's in the Smithsonian's collection. There's a picture taken in the Presidio during Thanksgiving, probably in the 50s.
No, this was in the Fillmore.
Is it Fillmore?
Yeah.
But, oops. Go back. Just that you can see that the sort of military presence was a kind of constant. We've seen pictures of people in the bars with sailor outfits and things, so that was always. This was Eddie Alley, who was part of a family. But a drummer who played a lot, and we met him later, and here's Elizabeth interviewing he and his wife, and they showed us a picture, well, this was them at a musicians union celebration. It was actually celebrating the integration of the musicians union, and here's a picture of them when they got married. So it was interesting, sometimes we could sort of get people's stories. So
the musicians union in San Francisco was segregated until the early 1960s, and so that celebration, the photo you saw before of them, was celebrating the anniversary of when the two unions came together and were integrated.
So one of the clubs that we always heard a lot about was called Jimbo's Bop City. This is a ticket, or a reproduction of a ticket. And it was, like I said, it was open usually at midnight or 2 in the morning when you couldn't serve liquor. So a lot of people would bring in brown bag it. And there was, it was at one point on Post, right?
Post and Buchanan.
Yeah.
It was in an old Japanese restaurant. So again, when the Japanese were interned, first actually Slim Gaillard got the lease. It was leased by Charles Sullivan, who spoke about, the mayor of Fillmore Street, and Slim Gaillard, who was a great musician but a terrible businessman, ran it as Vault City for a little while and then skipped town, owing everybody and their mother money. So Charles Sullivan looked around to see who else might take over the lease, and he turned to a gentleman named Jimbo Edwards, who at the time was working at a car dealership downtown. And Jimbo first actually opened it up as a restaurant, as a waffle shop.
That was that picture I showed you there.
And there was a small room in the back, and so musicians would come into the waffle shop and eat, and they're like, well, can we jam in your back room? He's like, oh yeah, sure, why not?
And then people started
showing up. And then it just exploded. It became this, I mean, it really was internationally known. These murals that you see in the background were commissioned by Jimbo, by Harry Smith, who some people might know. He's an experimental filmmaker. He did the folk anthology that's pretty well known, and he was broke and lived above Bop City, and Jimbo kind of took care of him by letting him eat downstairs and said, in exchange, you paint these murals, you can eat at and come into my club for free. And so that's how the murals came to be on the walls of Bop City.
He assembled a lot of musical recordings, right?
Yeah, he did the folk anthology. Yeah. So yeah, he did a number of things.
He also did experiments where he would film while people were improvising around the film, and he would do that in the...
Or he'd paint.
Yeah,
he'd paint.
Right.
While jazz musicians were playing, and he'd have an easel set up, and he would paint inspired by what the music was telling him to do. So he's a pretty cool cat. He was only in the Fillmore till probably 1953, and then he moved on. But
here's Duke Ellington in the sort of in the middle of that crowd, surrounded by women.
Everyone's so glamorous.
Yeah, I know, the clothes.
Like, whoa.
Yeah. No, it's really true. Yeah.
Look at them.
So these are all in Bop City.
Right. And, there's a story of all of them, but they'd have these cutting things, and if you sort of wanted to sit in and couldn't play, they would ask you to leave. So what we heard was, that's actually Teddy Edwards, who is a really well-known musician, but the guy with the glasses and the saxophone has just been asked to leave. He kind of has the deer in the headlights looks. He did not measure up. And there was a kind of house bass, and everybody said it was the worst bass in the world, so most of the bass players would bring their own bass.
That's Jimbo, the owner of the club.
This is
Paul Gonzalez.
one of Duke Ellington's. And here's actually another picture of him. So it's funny, in the pictures it sort of looks like this big place. It actually was a little room in a Victorian.
Smaller than this.
Yeah. We were trying to find out who this woman is. I think we thought we'd identified her, but I'm not sure.
No, we did.
But I thought we were told, because I remember after that we were told it wasn't. This is an ongoing conversation between us.
No, I again, in reading the Sun Reporters, right. I came across an article, and it's in the book. I can't remember her name, but
she wasn't she Tristano?
She was the wife of Lenny Tristano.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Anyway, my guess is, knowing musicians in the 50s and how sexist, she must have really been able to play to be able to sit in.
Jimbo again.
What was this?
Pardon?
No liquor served.
Oh, no liquor.
Right.
Yeah. He was
sold on this.
Right, yeah, it wasn't sold, but it was definitely consumed.
Right.
Yeah, but he got busted a few times. I have read some stories in the Sun Reporter where he got busted.
That's Herb Caen, the columnist, to the right of him. Here's Chet Baker and Jimbo's.
Chet Baker actually was in the Army and was stationed in the Presidio, and so he would sneak out after lights out. He would sneak out and come down to the Fillmore clubs and sit in.
This is Louis Armstrong in front of a mural of him. Johnny Mathis was from San Francisco, and it's an interesting picture of him here. One of the things, and this is what it looked like, and it kind of looked like this. They did clear away some of the rubble, but there were kind of empty lots in many parts of this neighborhood for years because, as you said, they couldn't get financing, and like it was something that you'd want to do. It didn't give that look to me. This is John Handy, who's one of the people on the front cover, and it was interesting. He trace and talk to people. You know, that we were able to look at. We'd have photographs of him. Here he is in front of an installation, and this is the photograph that's on the cover. And this is, I said, this is John Handy is on the left. That's Tony Poindexter, who's in the next middle, and then next to him is a very young John Coltrane, who was in town with a touring band, and then next to him is Frank Fisher. And I remember that we've either given Frank and John are still with us, but I think I gave Pointy's grandson a copy of the book, and I gave Alice Coltrane a copy, and she said she'd never seen a photograph of him that young. We said early 50s?
That was 1953.
Okay, she's the woman who knows the dates. Yeah.
So was he still in R&B at this time, or was that he was an early travelist?
Yeah.
He was.
R&B bands back in the 50s.
I just found out, and I can look on my phone, literally 2 days ago, somebody connected the dots of who he was touring with, and they stopped in San Francisco, and that's when he was in that picture. I'd have to look at my phone though.
So he'd come to Jimbo's probably like at 2 in the morning to jam, because that's where everybody would do it. Yeah, but I think he was playing jazz then, because Frank Fisher, who lives actually in Richmond, where I do, said that that's what they were doing when they were playing. So this is what the new edition of the book, which is larger and has more pages, looks like. Although in 2006 we had an exhibit and kind of release of the book, and the two people in the middle are John Handy and Frank Fisher, who are on the cover. So again, we were sort of thrilled that sort of things could come full circle and that the tradition would continue. And we've been able to do a number of installations on Fillmore Street, in the very place where some of the clubs were. And I remember there was an older gentleman right here, and I came up to him, of course, being curious, and said, "So what do you think of this?" And he said, "I come here every day because it reminds me of the best time of my life." Because especially in the 40s and 50s, when the people had money, there was full employment, and there was, you could sort of you could go from club to club and see music or get a drink, and it was a pretty amazing time.
Well, and especially coming from the South.
Yeah.
I mean, even though San Francisco had issues and had some segregation compared to the South, I mean, everyone said it was incredible.
So one of the empty lots eventually was developed, and this is actually where at one point it's housing. There's a restaurant that's still there called 1300, and there's also was a jazz heritage kind of center. And then there was Yoshi's, which was the jazz club that's both in Oakland and for a while was here, although they didn't make it. It didn't work. This is Marcus Books. So what happened was there was kind of a renaissance in this neighborhood, and then some of it's kind of because of gentrification and this kind of changing demographics, it couldn't be sustained. But this is Marcus Books, which is the first African-American bookstore in the country, and this is actually the building where Jimbo's Bop City was. During the redevelopment, some of the Victorians were moved rather than being torn down. And they actually lost their lease a couple of years ago, and so some of the African-American businesses that came back are now boarded up, so it's been a kind of second sort of tragedy. But we've been trying to, and we've had the opportunity earlier to kind of present this work in the neighborhood where it happened. And some people moved out of San Francisco, but some people moved to the surrounding areas. I just was involved in a conference about the African American response to the Summer of Love, and Haight-Ashbury, which is kind of the next community over, was where a number of people were displaced by the redevelopment. You'll see examples. There's a photographer, Jim Marshall, who photographed during the Summer of Love, and like during the Human Being, and when the Grateful Dead would play for free on the street, you'd see families and kids from the neighborhood who were hanging out, and it's kind of belies the fact that the counterculture was a completely white thing. It wasn't. This is actually in a restaurant 1300, which kind of was built and has as its theme a sort of reference to this Fillmore's past, and we helped to curate that. And I think that is it. Yes.
Tell me a little bit about the arch. I mean, how did that come into being? Was it just a light, that particular intersection?
The arches.
Yeah, the very first slide, you had the arch and the light in the middle of it. Can you talk about that?
Sure. So at the time when the all of the after the earthquake, you know, the government offices and the department stores and entertainment nightclubs and stuff were in the Fillmore. Because that was the closest place that was still intact after the 1906 earthquake. When they went back to the buildings that had been rebuilt, the merchants, that remained were worried that people weren't going to come to the Fillmore anymore. And so, how do you get people to come to the neighborhood? So, besides deciding that the Fillmore would be one of San Francisco's destination spots for entertainment, they decided that the way that they were going to attract people is to create these arches that were not only illuminated in all four corners of each intersection for, I think it was 18 blocks. And if you know Fillmore, it kind of, if you're coming from the Haight, Lower Haight, it goes up over a hill, then down, and then kind of goes back up the hill. So if you're standing on either end of the hill, either the Pacific Heights end or towards the Lower Haight end, and you're looking into the Fillmore, I guess it's kind of a valley, you would see this illumination of the entire street for blocks and blocks and blocks. And so it was another way to attract attention to the neighborhood. It was said that it was the most illuminated street in the country for a time. So it brought attention to the neighborhood. It's one of the ways that the merchants, got people to come down to see the neighborhood. And even if 1914, I mean, it really wasn't a whole lot of, electricity was still pretty new. So it was also, there was the 1915 Panama Pacific exhibition that was at the Palace of Fine Arts, which is in the Marina District. And so Fillmore Street goes through the Fillmore, through Pacific Heights, down Cow Hollow, and then ends in the Marina. And so it was also a way to kind of funnel the tourists that were there for the exhibition, come back towards us to the Fillmore District. So that was another reason why they created it.
Yeah.
Was records cut in this area? In that area?
We were just interviewed by a radio station in Washington, D.C. today, and there was a question about that. There was not a really big recording kind of scene in San Francisco for some reason, which is interesting. A lot of people had to leave; they had to go to New York or to L.A. But there was some recording, and was a pretty strong blues scene, primarily in Oakland, but also in San Francisco. And some of that, there were people that recorded. She knows more about that. But
so there was one label that came out of the Fillmore during the jazz era, and it was created by David Rosenbaum. So it was called Rhythm Records. It was an outshoot of his record store. And he used a tiny recording studio that was on the second floor of the Sherman Clay piano sales showroom downtown. And so guys from the neighborhood would come, David would get guys from the neighborhood and then bring them down to Sherman Clay and then release their 78s on his Rhythm Records label. The most famous of all his recordings is done by Saunders King, who had a regional hit in 1947 called SK Blues. He later recorded for Aladdin Records and a couple of the others, but he got his start on rhythm, and David was a huge fan of his. And so he did a couple of 78s with David before he got picked up by bigger labels and went down to LA to record.
And Saunders King's daughter was Deborah Santana, who was married to Carlos Santana for a while, and she's also been very supportive of the project.
Wow, nice.
Yeah.
Anybody else?
What was the integration like? I noticed in your book there's a lot of people amongst the blacks, and what was, what were the rules then, or something?
Well, it was called, actually, even as early as right after the earthquake, one of the most integrated neighborhoods west of the Mississippi. But having said that, a lot of the clubs and restaurants until World War II were segregated. So even though you had this really diverse neighborhood, there was a lot of places that they could not go into. And the reason why the Fillmore was so diverse in many ways is because there's these things called racial covenants in the deeds of the houses, many of the houses in San Francisco. And a racial covenant is a thing that's written into your deed, and you still, some houses, when you buy a house, it's still there, that says if you can only live there if you're white, basically, is what it says. And so the Fillmore was one of the few areas where I think because it had previously been a Jewish neighborhood, and Jews also faced discrimination in housing up until the late 1920s. That's why the Fillmore, welcomed anyone.
And you can see in some of the photographs, there was examples that the audience, I think as you were mentioning, was pretty integrated. So I think people were obviously felt comfortable because they were there and they wanted to see the music. The music became and that was both rhythm and blues and jazz. I mean, jazz probably in the 50s especially was like popular music. And then that time changed as other tastes changed, and I'm sure that had something to do with the sort of viability.
So the feeling was enough that white people felt comfortable to go there.
Oh yeah, and were welcomed as well. And besides, it was way cooler than what was going on downtown. So it wasn't all stuffy. It was really fun.
Yeah.
But having said that, the cops were pretty racist at that time and were often busting the clubs, and back to Saunders King's career was really screwed up because one of the head cops in San Francisco at that time hated him because he dated white women, and found out that he had gone back to a hotel room with a white woman and busted him and threw him in jail and trumped up all these charges, and it really it stalled his career for a couple of years, and really his daughter said that, it troubled him till he died. It really, really bothered him. So it wasn't all, groovy hugs and kisses in San Francisco as we like to think. There was issues there. It just wasn't as bad as like the South.
So I was wondering, in terms of your research, is there a lot of written documentation, or is it oral history? How do you research something like this? Like, did the clubs keep a list of guys who played there, or just like, it seems like an amazing task to be able to pull all this together.
I mean, we were lucky in that they partly for the commerce, they hired photographers because it was the customers liked the fact you could be seen there. So that's kind of how we had the visual record, and then what we have gotten has been interviewing people from the time. I mean, but there was not. I mean, and none of that was public. Like I think before you came, like we were looking. The library had nothing. Most of the archives, and in fact, one of the things that's happened from the beginning of this investigation is that the library now and other places have growing archives, so this history actually is being replicated.
Yeah, be bigger than even what you're doing.
Yeah, they realized that they had really been
a big gap.
poor. Yeah, they had a big gap in their collections. Because when I did the pamphlet for Bill Graham, the first thing I did was go to the library. I went to the California Historical Society, and the library had literally 3 pictures of the black neighborhood, and Cal Historical Society had none. I mean, I was shocked, and so I just started walking around the neighborhood talking to people that looked old enough to have lived that history. And in fact, I was so obsessed with it that I was taking a cab. When I'd take cab rides, talk to bus drivers. So I was taking a cab ride to the Fillmore, talking to the cab driver, and told him what I was doing. And he's like, oh, I used to play cards with this guy. I think he was one of the photographers in the clubs. And I'm like, oh, well, here's my card. If you find him, let me know. And I was stupid. I got out. I didn't get his contact information. For a month, I was just like, oh, why did I do that? And then he called me, and he's like, okay, I found the guy. He's in Hunters Point. he said he's kind of sick, but he'll talk to you. So Hunters Point's it's changed now, but at the time was the big black neighborhood in San Francisco after the Fillmore. So I went out to Hunters Point with my husband, and a guy was named Steve Jackson, and he took me downstairs, and he had this card table in his garage, and he poured me this giant glass of the worst white wine I've ever had in my life. So I kind of, this is 10 o'clock in the morning. And I took a little sip, and he's watching me. He's like, "You don't drink much, do you?" I'm like, "No." He's like, "Well, drink up." I'm like, "Okay." And I guess I passed the test, because then he gets up and he had this wall with this big curtain on, and it was let's make a deal. He pulls back the curtain, and there's from this tall floor to ceiling boxes of negatives and photos, and he starts pulling them out, and I was just I called Blue Oak, and I'm like, "Oh my God, you will not believe what I am seeing right now." And he was the one that took the cover of the book, the photo with John Coltrane. He was the main photographer in Bop City, so he was there almost every night photographing whoever happened to show up. So it was things like that just,
It was really interesting because the experience you're talking about is totally parallel to my father's experience in Baltimore. Mm-hmm. That richness in the neighborhood and jazz clubs everywhere, and just so it's really nice to hear that wasn't just on the East Coast.
No, yeah. Well, it's really been interesting. There was a guy who was in Pittsburgh called Teeny One Shot Harris, and his photographs were very much like this. I've seen photographs from the Jackson area of Seattle. Because everybody they were going to clubs, and the people that came wherever they went, from the east, the southeast to the northeast, they wanted to hear jazz and rhythm and blues, and it was documented. And so it was interesting. There was a point when that was happening parallel, and in many ways no one knew about it. It was just underground. So that has been really interesting to sort of see. Yeah. But
the thing that I think not only it's okay, the film was really cool, the music was amazing, the photos are incredible, but I think what any community these days can take away from the Fillmore is the cautionary tale of, how are communities created? Who gets to say who gets to live there and who doesn't? Who gets to decide the policies that shape communities? And that's relevant to us here in Ojai right now. Right, as our community becomes more expensive, families find it challenging to buy a house or even to rent here now, and our schools are losing kids. And so I think it's important, the way that the Fillmore, in some ways, is an amazing thing, because redevelopment happened in 2 phases, A1 and A2. A1, they kind of were blindsided, they had no idea what was happening to them. But they got savvy pretty darn quick, and they banded together as a community and said, "We don't want this in our community. This is not how we see our neighborhood. And just because a lot of us are renters doesn't mean that we can't have a say in the way that what happens to our community." And so they formed an organization called Waco, and they brought a lawsuit against the San Francisco Redevelopment Agency and the city of San Francisco. And it was the first time in the history of the United States where a community group said, "We have a right to steer our neighborhood and decide what happens to it." And sadly, because so many buildings had already been torn down, when they won the lawsuit, which was a precedent-setting lawsuit, which really transformed the way redevelopment happened in the rest of the country forever after,